Eleanor Whitaker drove the nail so hard, the hammer slipped and split her palm wide open. She didn't stop. Blood ran down her wrist, soaked into the cuff of her faded dress, and dripped onto the raw timber she'd hauled up that roof herself before sunrise. She wrapped her hand with the strip torn from her apron, pressed her teeth together until her jaw ached, and kept going. Because stopping meant they were right. And Eleanor Whitaker had not come 300 miles through mountain country to prove anybody right. If this story moves you, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along with me until the very end. Because I promise you, this one is going to stay with you. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Wyoming, summer of 1886, and meet the woman who refused to break. The town of Red Willow, Wyoming sat at the base of the mountains like a man who'd given up trying to climb. It had one general store, one church with a crooked steeple, one saloon that never seemed to close, and approximately 300 people who believed that the way things were was the way things had to be. Nobody in Red Willow believed in wasted effort. And in the summer of 1886, every single one of them agreed that Eleanor Whitaker was the purest definition of wasted effort they had ever seen. She had arrived in early April on a wagon that looked like it had been through a war and lost, one mule pulling it. A big, slope-backed animal named Gideon, who moved like he resented every step. The wagon carried an axe, a handsaw, 2 coils of rope, a crate of seed, a small iron stove, and a deed to 60 acres of valley land that nobody in Red Willow had bothered claiming in 11 years. There was a reason nobody had claimed it. The valley sat in a low pocket between 2 ridgelines, cut off from the main road by 3 miles of rough terrain. The creek that ran through it flooded in spring and ran nearly dry by August. The soil was thin on the western side and rocky everywhere else. 2 men had tried to homestead there in the 1870s. Both had left before their first winter ended. People in town knew all of this. They told Eleanor all of this. She thanked them politely and drove Gideon toward the valley road anyway. Martha Hicks, who ran the general store and considered herself the social conscience of Red Willow, watched Eleanor's wagon disappear around the bend and shook her head slowly. "That woman," Martha said to no one in particular, "is going to be back here inside of a month, crying." Her husband Earl, who was sweeping the porch and had learned over 30 years of marriage that agreeing with Martha was the only survival strategy worth knowing, nodded. "Yes, dear," he said. But Eleanor did not come back inside a month. She did not come back crying at all. What did was work. From the morning she arrived at those 60 acres and walked every inch of them alone, stepping over rocks and crouching beside the creek and pressing her palm flat against the soil like she was listening to it breathe, Eleanor Whitaker operated on a single principle. Every problem had a solution. You just had to be willing to find it. The cabin was the first problem. The previous homesteaders had left a foundation, 4 stone walls barely knee-high, with the remnants of a floor that had rotted through years ago. Eleanor studied it for one full morning, walked around it 17 times counting her steps, and decided it was salvageable. She spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but clearing timber from the hillside above the valley. Not small timber, not branches or scrub wood, full-grown pine, 18 inches across, that she felled herself with the axe she'd sharpened every night since leaving Missouri. The sound of that axe carried down through the valley and up to the road, and more than once a rider would slow their horse at the ridge and look down at the small figure working alone in the trees and feel something between confusion and unease. Nobody rode down to ask if she needed help. That was not how Red Willow worked. Eleanor didn't expect help. She had stopped expecting help from other people a long time ago, in a courtroom in Kansas City, where a judge had ruled in favor of a man named Gerald Holt and against her father, and signed the paper that ended everything her family had built over 30 years. Water rights. That was what it came down to. Gerald Holt had wanted the creek that ran through the Whitaker farm, and Gerald Holt had known the right lawyers, and the right lawyers had known the right judge, and her father had stood in that courtroom with nothing but the truth and his own honest word, and it had not been enough. Thomas Whitaker had walked out of that courthouse looking 10 years older than he'd walked in. He was dead before the following spring. Eleanor had held his hand at the end, in the small room above the hardware store where they'd been living since losing the farm, and she had made him a promise she hadn't told another living soul. She was going to have land of her own, land that no man could take, land she had built with her own hands, in her own name, that would stand as long as she stood. That was the promise she drove nails with. That was the promise she felled timber with. That was the promise that made her wrap a torn apron around a bleeding hand and keep going. By June, the cabin walls were up. Not pretty. Nobody looking at Eleanor Whitaker's cabin in June of 1886 would have called it pretty. The logs weren't perfectly matched. There was a gap on the north wall she'd had to pack with clay because she'd miscalculated the length on two of her beams. The door frame leaned 3 degrees to the left, which bothered her considerably, but which she'd decided to address after the roof was on, and the more immediate problem of dying in the open was solved. The roof was what she was working on the morning Caleb Walker rode through the valley. She heard the horse before she saw it, a steady, unhurried sound coming from the eastern trail, the kind of pace that belonged to a man who was going somewhere specific rather than wandering. She did not look up from the timber she was positioning. She was standing on the top of the north wall, 8 feet off the ground, with a beam balanced across her shoulder and a hammer hanging from her belt. And she had learned early in this process that stopping to look at things had a cost, and the cost was usually momentum. She swung the beam into position, drove 3 nails in fast succession, tested the joint with her full weight leaning on it, and only then turned to look at the rider. I was stopped about 40 yards out, sitting his horse with the particular stillness of a man who had been watching for longer than she'd noticed. Dark bay horse, tall, well kept in the way that working animals were when their owners knew what they were doing. The man himself was somewhere around 40, lean in the way that years of hard outdoor work made a man lean, with a hat that had seen at minimum one serious storm and broad shoulders that sat square and easy in the saddle. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and dark eyes that were fixed on her with an expression she couldn't quite read from 40 yards. Not pity. She'd gotten very good at identifying pity, and this wasn't it. Not skepticism exactly. Something more like consideration. Like a man who had expected one thing and was recalibrating in real time. He rode closer, stopped again at about 20 yards. His eyes moved from Eleanor to the cabin walls, up to the roof beams she'd already laid, across to the cleared timber stacked neat beside the foundation, and back to her. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You built this alone?" Eleanor looked at him. She had heard that question before, from men in town, who asked it the way they might ask whether a dog had learned to read, with the tone of something that shouldn't be possible, and probably wasn't. This man's tone was different. He asked it the way a man asks a question when he's genuinely uncertain of the answer and genuinely wants to know. She said, "Yes, every piece." He looked at the cabin again. She watched him look at it and waited for what usually came next. The unsolicited advice, the gentle implication that she should have done things differently, the offer to take over that dressed itself up as an offer to help. It didn't come. He just nodded, once, slow. "Good work on the east wall," he said. "That joint where you doubled the corner log, most men don't think to do that." Eleanor blinked. In 2 months of building this cabin, nobody had said anything remotely like that to her. "It distributes the load better," she said, because that was why she'd done it, and she didn't know what else to say. "I know," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Caleb Walker. I run the Walker Ranch, up the North Ridge about 4 miles. "Eleanor Whitaker," she said. "I run this." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. "I can see that," he said. He rode out the way he'd come, and Eleanor watched him go, and then turned back to her roof, because the day wasn't getting any longer, and she still had 3 beams to position before the light failed. She told herself she'd already forgotten about him before she drove the next nail. She hadn't. The next morning he came back. No announcement. No explanation. He rode into the yard with a bundle of cedar shingles strapped across the back of his horse and set them down near the cabin without a word. Eleanor climbed down from the roof, where she'd been since before sunrise, and stood with her hands on her hips and looked at the shingles and then at him. "I didn't ask for those," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," he said. "Cedar holds better at this elevation than pine. You're using pine shingles." She was using pine shingles because cedar was more expensive, and she was tracking every cent she spent. She looked at him. "What do you want for them?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "People don't do things for nothing." I was quiet for a moment. He had a way of going quiet that wasn't evasive. It was like he was simply choosing his words with care, which was a practice Eleanor respected even when she found it inconvenient. "My wife," he said finally. "She was a woman who built things too, practical. Didn't ask for help either." He paused. "She died 6 years ago. Bad winter." Eleanor said nothing. "I reckon," he said slowly, "that when I see somebody doing good work, I'd rather help it stand than watch it fall. That's all." He picked up his hat, which he'd been holding in his hands, and put it back on his head. "I'll be going now." He started back toward his horse. "Mr. Walker," Eleanor said. He stopped. She looked at the shingles. She looked at the roof that still needed doing. She thought about the rain that was coming. She could feel it in the way the mountains were holding the clouds, and she'd lost 3 nights of work already to a leaking tarp. "Thank you," she said. It cost her something to say it. He seemed to understand that. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and rode away again. That was how it began. Not with romance. Not with any kind of declaration or dramatic gesture. It began with cedar shingles and a man who understood what good work looked like. Caleb Walker appeared 3 more times in June, each time with something specific and practical that Eleanor had not asked for and would not have admitted she needed. A better quality of rope. The mountain winds were harder on rope than flatland winds, and she'd already had 2 lines snap. A bag of lime for sealing the gaps in the stone foundation before moisture crept in. A hand-drawn map of the valley that showed where the water table was deepest, annotated in a cramped, careful handwriting that suggested a man who had been paying attention to this land for a long time. Eleanor accepted each of these things with fewer words than the time before. On the 4th visit, when he arrived to find her struggling to lift a ridgepole into position on her own. A problem of simple physics, 2 people being necessary for the job. She looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Are you going to stand there, or are you going to help?" He didn't say anything. He just walked over and took the other end of the pole. They lifted it together. It went into place cleanly, and Eleanor said, "Hold it," and climbed up and drove the fastening nails before it could shift. And when she came back down, she looked at the joint and nodded. "Good," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She made coffee on the iron stove, which she'd finally gotten properly leveled and functioning, and they drank it standing outside in the morning air and didn't talk much, and it was not uncomfortable. That was unusual. Eleanor was not a woman who found silence comfortable with other people. She had spent too much of her life around people who used silence as a weapon. Her late husband, a man named Charles Whitaker, she'd married at 20 because her mother had been frightened for her future, and Charles had seemed steady, had used silence as punishment, as pressure, as a way of making her feel the walls closing in. She had left Charles after 3 years, which in 1880 in the state of Missouri was not a simple thing to do, and had cost her in ways she did not often allow herself to think about. She had come to Wyoming to stop paying costs she hadn't chosen. But Caleb Walker's silence was different. It was the silence of a man who simply didn't see the need to fill every empty space with noise. It was restful in the way that open country was restful. Not empty exactly, but giving you room to breathe. Eleanor noticed this. She filed it away and didn't examine it too closely. In July, the crops she'd planted in May started showing real promise. The eastern field, which had better moisture retention than she'd originally calculated, was coming in stronger than she'd expected. The western field was thinner, but growing. The kitchen garden beside the cabin was producing enough that she wasn't spending money on vegetables from Martha Hicks's store, which pleased her considerably. She was making the cabin her own in small ways. A shelf she'd built inside for her books, 3 of them, which she read by lantern light after the day's work was done. A peg on the wall for her coat. a small rag rug she'd brought from Missouri that had belonged to her mother. It was beginning to feel like a home. Not yet, but beginning. Then, one Tuesday morning in the middle of July, Eleanor drove Gideon into town for supplies and walked into Martha Hicks's store to find 3 women already inside who stopped talking the moment she came through the door. Eleanor knew that particular silence. She'd grown up around it. She picked up her basket and began moving through the store, gathering what she needed. Martha Hicks appeared from behind the counter with an expression that she likely believed was sympathetic. "Eleanor," Martha said, "I hear Caleb Walker's been out to your place a few times." "He has," Eleanor said. "People are talking." "People in this town seem to talk about most things," Eleanor said pleasantly. "I find it a consistent characteristic." One of the women by the window made a small sound. Martha pressed on. "It doesn't look right. A single woman having a man out to her property regular-like. People are starting to wonder what your arrangement is." Eleanor set a tin of coffee down on the counter and looked at Martha Hicks directly. "My arrangement," Eleanor said, "is that I own 60 acres of valley land. I'm building a homestead on it, and occasionally a neighbor helps with jobs that require 2 pairs of hands. That's the same arrangement every farmer in this valley has with every other farmer in this valley, except that the farmers in this valley are men, so nobody wonders anything." Martha opened her mouth. "I'll take the coffee," Eleanor said, "and the flour, and a pound of the dried beans, if they're fresh." She finished her shopping and drove Gideon back to the valley and spent the rest of the afternoon splitting wood with more force than was strictly necessary. When Caleb came by 2 days later, she told him what Martha had said. She told him because she believed he should know, and because she was not a woman who managed other people's perceptions by hiding things from them. He listened to the whole account without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You want me to stop coming by?" he said. It wasn't a question exactly, more like a door held open. Eleanor thought about it. She thought about the ridgepole they'd lifted together, which she physically could not have done alone. She thought about the cedar shingles holding solid on the roof through 2 weeks of rain. She thought about the coffee drunk in easy silence. "No," she said. "I want you to keep coming by because it's useful and decent, and it's nobody else's business. What I want to know is whether the talk is going to be a problem for you." He looked at her. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "I'm 40 years old, and I've lived alone on a mountain ranch for 6 years, and I stopped caring what people in Red Willow said about me around year 2. So no, it's not going to be a problem for me." Eleanor nodded. "Good," she said. The summer deepened. The crops held. The cabin roof stopped leaking. Eleanor built a proper door with a working latch and hung it herself, and the first night she closed it and heard it click into place. She stood in the middle of the single room of her cabin with her lantern casting its circle of gold light on the walls she had built, and she felt something she hadn't felt since she was a very small girl on her father's farm before everything went wrong. Safe, not saved, not rescued, not dependent on the goodwill of someone else's protection. Safe because she had made herself safe with her own hands on land that was hers. She sat down on the edge of her cot and breathed that in for a while. Then she blew out the lantern and went to sleep, because tomorrow was going to be another long day, and she had learned, across the course of this summer, that rest was not a luxury. It was maintenance, the same as sharpening the axe or sealing the foundation, and that treating yourself as a tool worth maintaining was not weakness. It was the kind of wisdom Eleanor had earned the hard way. Outside, the Wyoming mountains held the dark the way they always did, close and vast and indifferent to the small lights of human life moving around at their feet. And in a cabin that had been nothing but foundation stones and a deed on paper. 4 months ago, a woman slept the sleep of someone who had earned every inch of the ground beneath her, several miles up the North Ridge, in a ranch house that had good bones and too many empty rooms. Caleb Walker sat on his porch in the dark and looked at the stars for a while before going inside. He had not sat on the porch at night in a long time. He hadn't found much reason to. He wasn't sure what to make of that. I went inside and didn't think about it any further, because Caleb Walker was a man who had learned, through considerable painful experience, That thinking too hard about things you weren't sure of was a good way to talk yourself into and out of things that were better handled by simply paying attention. He would pay attention. He was good at that. The valley below, in the dark, was quiet. But it no longer felt empty. August came in hard. The kind of heat that sat on your shoulders, like something with weight and intention, that made the air above the dry grass shimmer and bend, and turned every afternoon into an endurance test. Eleanor had learned by now that Wyoming summer didn't ask permission. It simply arrived and demanded you adjust or quit, and quitting was not a category she operated in. She was up before sunrise every morning. That had not changed since April. What had changed was the quality of the work. It was no longer survival-level construction, the desperate business of getting 4 walls and a roof standing before the next rain came. The cabin was solid now. The roof held. The door latched clean. She had chinked every gap in the log walls with a mixture of clay and dry grass that had set hard as mortar, and the interior, while spare, was hers. In a way that went past ownership into something she didn't quite have a word for. Belonging, maybe. She had not belonged to a place since her father's farm, and she had been a child then, which meant she'd belonged to it the way all children belong to the places they grew up in, without knowing it, without understanding that belonging was a thing that could be taken. She knew now. She wasn't taking it for granted. The crops were the current urgency. The eastern field had come in strong, but strong wasn't the same as done, and done wasn't the same as stored, and the first frost in the Wyoming mountains came earlier than most people raised in lower country expected. Eleanor had already spoken to a man named Pete Garrity, who ran a small grain operation outside of town, and Pete had told her, bluntly and without cruelty, that she had maybe 6 weeks from the 1st of August before she needed to have everything in and under cover. 6 weeks. She made lists the way her father had taught her. Everything that needed doing, broken into days, broken into hours. The mathematics of survival. It was calming in the same way that the axe work was calming. Specific, measurable, something you could see the progress of. Caleb came by on the 3rd of August and found her sitting outside the cabin door with her list, a mug of coffee going cold beside her. A look on her face he had come to recognize as the expression of a woman doing hard arithmetic in her head. He read the list over her shoulder without asking permission, which would have irritated her from most people, and didn't from him, which was something she'd stopped trying to fully analyze. "You're short 2 weeks of labor," he said. "I know," she said. "You want help with the harvest." It was not a question. He'd learned she responded better to statements than to offers. Offers required her to ask for something, which she found difficult, but responding to a stated fact was just practical. "I'm paying for help," she said. "I'm not taking charity." "All right," he said. $1.50 a day. That's half what you'd pay a field hand. My time's my own to price how I want." She looked it up at him. "You have your own harvest to bring in. My foreman handles most of it. I've got the time." She studied him for a moment with those level gray eyes that had a way of making a man feel he was being measured for accuracy rather than judgment. $1.50, she said. "And you eat lunch here." "Deal," he said. He sat down on the step beside her and picked up the list, and they worked through it together, reorganizing the order of tasks so the most weather-sensitive crops came in first, the way people who understood land worked. Not with romance, not with sentiment, but with practical efficiency that was its own kind of language. It was Nora Finch who brought the trouble. Nora ran the Red Willow Ladies Auxiliary and had appointed herself the moral weather vane of the town approximately 20 years earlier and had never been convinced to step down. She was not a cruel woman exactly. She was the kind of woman who had lived her entire life inside a very specific set of rules and had decided, the way people sometimes did, that the rules were the same thing as virtue. She arrived at Eleanor's property on a Wednesday morning with 2 other women from the auxiliary and a covered basket that Eleanor strongly suspected contained a pie, because that was how the Ladies' Auxiliary of Red Willow delivered judgments, wrapped in baked goods. Caleb was there when they arrived. He was in the eastern field with Eleanor, the 2 of them working side by side down the rows, and the picture they made, a man and a woman, working close together, no chaperone, no visible propriety, was apparently everything Nora Finch had come to investigate. Eleanor saw them at the fence line and straightened up and walked over. "Mrs. Finch," she said. "Ladies, Eleanor." Nora's eyes traveled past her to Caleb, who had not stopped working. "We heard Caleb Walker had been spending considerable time out here. We thought we'd come and see how you were getting on." "I'm getting on fine," Eleanor said. "As you can see." "Yes, well." Nora's gaze swept the cabin, the fields, the general evidence of industry, and Eleanor could see the woman trying to reconcile what she'd expected with what was in front of her. "It's the appearance of things we're concerned about, dear. You're an unmarried woman. He's an unmarried man. People talk. People in this town," Eleanor said, keeping her voice even and her hands still at her sides, "seem to have a great deal of time for talking, and not very much for minding their own affairs. I've noticed that since I arrived." One of the other women inhaled sharply. Nora pressed her lips together. "We're trying to help you, Eleanor. Your reputation." "My reputation," Eleanor said, "is that I built a cabin alone on land everyone said was worthless, that I have crops in the ground and a roof over my head, and I haven't asked this town for a single thing since I got here. I'm comfortable with that reputation." "A woman alone is always vulnerable," Nora said, and there was something in her tone that shifted. Less judgment, more something that might have been genuine worry, which was almost more difficult to deal with. "That's not an insult. It's simply how things are. If Caleb Walker were to take advantage—" "He won't," Eleanor said flatly. "You can't know." "I know," Eleanor said, and the certainty in her voice was not bravado and it was not performance. It was the flat, calm certainty of a woman who had learned to read people through hard experience. "The way I know is that in 4 months, this man has never once told me what I couldn't do. He's never tried to run things. He's never made me feel like I owed him anything beyond what I agreed to pay." She paused. "That's more than I can say for most of the men I've known in my life, Mrs. Finch, and considerably more than this town offered me when I rode in." Silence. Nora Finch opened her mouth, closed it, and then looked past Eleanor again at Caleb, who had finally stopped working and was watching from the edge of the field with his arms loose at his sides. "He's a good man," Nora said finally, and her voice had changed. Quieter. Something personal in it that Eleanor hadn't expected. "I know that. I've always known that. I worry is all. Things happen to women who are alone." "Things happen to women who aren't alone too," Eleanor said, not unkindly. "I'm not being careless, Mrs. Finch. I'm being exactly as careful as I need to be, and I'm making my own determinations about what that looks like." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she set the basket down on the fence post. "Apple pie," she said. "Fresh this morning." She turned and walked back to the road, and the other 2 women followed her, and Eleanor stood there for a moment and then picked up the basket. She brought it back to where Caleb had resumed work. "Apple pie," she said. He looked at the basket. "Nora Finch's?" "Yes." "Her apple pie's the best in the county," he said. "I suspected as much." Eleanor set it in the shade near the water bucket. "We'll have it at noon." They went back to work. The conversation sat in Eleanor's chest for the rest of the morning, not heavy exactly, but present. Not because Nora Finch had said anything that frightened her. Because for one moment, when the older woman's voice had gone quiet and personal, Eleanor had heard something underneath the judgment that she recognized. Fear on behalf of someone. It was not nothing. It was not the shape of cruelty Eleanor had expected and prepared for. That made it, in some strange way, harder to deal with than cruelty would have been. At noon, they sat in the thin shade of the cabin's east wall and ate the pie, which was in fact extraordinary, and drank water, and were quiet for a while. "Nora Finch's husband," Caleb said eventually. "He was a hard man, before he died." Eleanor looked at him. "I didn't know that," she said. "Most people in town don't talk about it. Different time, different." He set his fork down. "She worries because she knows what can happen, that's all." Eleanor thought about that. "She could have just said so," she said. "People mostly don't say the real thing," Caleb said. "You know that." She did know that. She'd known it most of her life. "What was your wife's name?" she asked. She'd wondered before and hadn't asked. It felt like the right moment, which she couldn't entirely explain. Caleb was quiet for a beat that was longer than his usual quiet. "Margaret," he said, "how long were you married?" 7 years. He looked at the mountains, the way he did sometimes when he was working something through. She was a practical woman, like you, not much given to fuss. She had opinions and she said them. The corner of his mouth moved. Got her in trouble sometimes. Having opinions usually does, Eleanor said. She liked this valley, he said. Used to say it was the prettiest piece of land in Wyoming. We talked about building down here. Then the winter came and after that He stopped. You didn't want to be anywhere she'd wanted to be, Eleanor said quietly. He looked at her. Something like that, he said. Eleanor nodded. She understood the geography of grief, how certain places became unbearable, not because they were painful, but because they weren't, because they remained exactly as they'd been when the person was alive, and the contrast was worse than destruction. I'm sorry, she said. Not as a formality, as a fact. Yes, he said. And then, unexpectedly, I'm glad someone's building here. She'd have liked that. Eleanor looked at him. The moment was open and complicated, and she chose not to close it, and she chose not to step through it either. She let it exist. We should get back to work, she said. We should, he agreed. They finished the row by late afternoon and started the second, and Eleanor felt the particular satisfaction of a day that had been hard and productive and real, in the way that only physical work was real, the satisfaction that lived in her shoulders and her hands, and the steady ache of muscles used as they were meant to be used. That evening, just before Caleb rode out, he paused at the edge of the property and turned back. Eleanor, he said. She looked up from where she was closing the field gate. He seemed to be working with something, choosing words with that characteristic care. I want to tell you something, he said. You can take it however you want. All right, she said. I've watched you build this place from nothing, he said, and it's been a long time since I've admired something the way I admire what you've done here. I want you to know that, without any obligation attached to it. Eleanor stood very still. In her experience, compliments from men arrived wrapped in expectations. They were currency, offered in advance of a purchase. She'd learned to be careful of them. But she looked at Caleb Walker, and she thought about 4 months of cedar shingles and ridgepoles and an apple pie and the word Margaret said quietly in afternoon shade, and she made a determination. Thank you, she said. I received that in the spirit it was offered. Something crossed his face. Not quite surprise, but close. Good night, Miss Whitaker, he said. Good night, Mr. Walker, she said. She stood at the gate until she couldn't hear his horse anymore. Then she went inside and sat with her books and did not read. The trouble came the second week of August, from a direction Eleanor hadn't been watching. She'd been watching the crops. She'd been watching the weather. She'd been watching the gaps in her supply list and the money she had left and the work still ahead of her. She had not been watching the town. That was where the trouble started. A man named Richard Caldwell had his main ranch house on the east side of Red Willow, and his operation was the largest in the county. Cattle mostly, with some speculation in land and water rights that had made him considerably richer than the cattle alone would have. He was a man who was used to getting what he wanted, not because he was violent, but because he was patient and wealthy, and understood that most people, eventually, would sell. He had been aware of Eleanor Whitaker since April. He had not been concerned about Eleanor Whitaker since April, because she was a single woman on difficult land with no capital and no connections, and he had fully expected her to fail. She had not failed. That was the problem. What shifted Caldwell's attention from mild awareness to active interest was not the cabin or the crops. It was the spring. His land manager, a careful, methodical man named Tolliver, had ridden the valley boundary in late July and come back with a report that Caldwell had read 3 times. Eleanor Whitaker's 60 acres contained the headwaters of the Branch Creek that fed 3 of Caldwell's grazing pastures on the western side of his operation. The spring that fed it was on her land, had always been on that parcel, which was why nobody had paid attention to it for years, because nobody had thought the parcel was worth having. But if that spring was controlled, redirected, or simply held back, Caldwell's western pastures would be in serious trouble within 2 dry seasons. He had not built what he had by ignoring serious trouble. Eleanor didn't know any of this when she drove Gideon into town on a Thursday morning for her regular supply run. She was thinking about the second field and the timing of the harvest and whether she had enough rope for the hay bales. She was not thinking about Richard Caldwell, which was why she was unprepared when a man she didn't recognize stopped her on the main street, tipped his hat, and said pleasantly that Mr. Caldwell would very much like the chance to speak with her about a potential business proposition at her convenience, anytime she'd like to come by the Caldwell ranch. Eleanor looked at the man. "What kind of business proposition?" she said. "Mr. Caldwell prefers to discuss that in person," the man said. He kept smiling. It was a professional smile, warm on the surface, nothing underneath. "When you see Mr. Caldwell," Eleanor said, "you tell him I'm busy with harvest, and if he has something to say to me, he can come out to my property and say it." She drove Gideon around him and continued down the street. She told Caleb that afternoon. His face changed when she said Caldwell's name. Not much, but she'd gotten good at reading small changes in Caleb Walker's face. "Caldwell," he said. "You know him." "I know of him," Caleb said carefully. "He's bought up 4 parcels in this county in the last 8 years. All of them had water on them." Eleanor felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "He wants the spring," she said. "That'd be my guess." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "He can't make me sell." "No," Caleb said. "He can't make you The way he said it, not quite finishing the thought, made Eleanor look at him. "But?" she said. He was quiet with that particular weighted quality again. "Caldwell doesn't make people sell," Caleb said. "He makes them want to sell. There's a difference." Eleanor understood immediately what he meant. She had watched Gerald Holt do exactly that to her father. Not force, not threat, just the slow accumulation of difficulty and doubt and isolation until surrender felt like the person's own idea. "I'm not my father," she said quietly, and the fierceness in her own voice surprised her. Caleb looked at her. "I know that," he said. "I'm just telling you what you're dealing with." "I know what I'm dealing with," she said. "I've known men like Caldwell my whole life." The next morning, she found her eastern fence cut. Not the whole fence, just a section, enough to let cattle drift through, which 2 of them had, trampling through the edge of her field and doing damage to about a 1/4 row of grain before she found it at first light. Eleanor stood at the edge of the damaged row for a long time. Her hands were fisted at her sides. Her jaw was set. Inside her chest was a hot, climbing anger that she recognized and respected and did not allow to make her foolish. She fixed the fence herself. She drove the cattle back. She assessed the damage carefully and determined it was significant, but not catastrophic. She'd lost maybe 8% of that row, and the rest could be salvaged if she got to it quickly. Then she went inside, made coffee, sat down at her table, and thought. This was what Caldwell expected her to do. React. Get frightened. Get emotional. Go running to someone. To Caleb, or to the sheriff, or to anyone, in a way that made her look unstable and dependent and easy to dismiss. She was not going to do that. She was going to get documentation. She took the list she'd been keeping of daily tasks and turned it over and began writing on the back. The date the fence was cut. The estimated time based on when she'd last checked that boundary. The number of cattle. The damage to the crop. She was precise and factual, and wrote it in the kind of careful handwriting that her father had taught her to use for records. The kind that said a person who wrote this way knew what records were for. When Caleb arrived mid-morning, she showed him the paper. He read it. "You're documenting it," he said. "From this moment forward," she said, "every incident, every piece of damage, every communication from Caldwell, or any representative of Caldwell. Written down, dated, witnessed where possible." He looked at her. There was something in his expression she hadn't quite seen before from him. It was not admiration exactly, not simply that, but something more specific. Recognition. The recognition of a man seeing someone think in a way he respected. "All right," he said. Witness it. Show me where to sign." She slid the paper across the table, and he signed his name at the bottom in that same cramped, careful handwriting as the valley map he'd made her months ago. She folded the paper and put it in the tin box she kept her deed in. "We need to talk about your neighbors," Caleb said. Eleanor looked up. "The Garrity family," he said. "Pete Garrity, the one you spoke to about the grain operation, and the Sullivans on the north side of the valley, and the Becker family east of town." He paused. "Caldwell has been after water rights from all three of them for 2 years. All three have been holding out." Another pause. "All three have been doing it alone." Eleanor was very still. "You're saying," she said slowly, "that we're not the only people Caldwell is pressuring." "You're the newest and most visible," Caleb said. "But no, not the only ones." The thing that happened in Eleanor's chest in that moment was not fear, and it was not anger. It was something colder and more focused. The feeling she got when a problem she'd thought was contained turned out to be much larger than it appeared, and the larger shape of it suddenly became clear. "Then I need to talk to Pete Garrity," she said. "You need to talk to Pete Garrity," he agreed. She drove out to the Garrity place that same afternoon, without Caleb, because this was something she needed to do herself, and because Pete Garrity was a proud man, and she'd learned that proud men were sometimes more willing to be direct with a woman than with another man, because a woman didn't threaten the careful architecture of their self-sufficiency the way another man might. Pete Garrity met her in the yard of his farmstead with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who was simultaneously curious about why she was there and determined not to show that curiosity. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Garrity," she said. "I'll be direct with you because I think direct is the right approach between neighbors. Richard Caldwell cut my fence 2 nights ago and ran cattle through my eastern field. I believe it was intentional. I believe it was because he wants my spring, and he's beginning his campaign to make me want to sell." Pete Garrity's arms stayed crossed, but something in his face shifted, the studied neutrality cracking just slightly at the edges. "And you're here because?" he said. "Because I understand he's been doing the same to you for 2 years, Eleanor said. "And to the Sullivans and the Beckers. And I think 4 families together have options that 1 family alone doesn't have." He was quiet. Eleanor waited. She had learned that patience was as much a tool as the axe. "My South water rights," Pete said finally. He had a lawyer come by in June. Said the original survey had an error. Said the creek had always been Caldwell's right of use, and I'd been taking it without legal standing. His jaw tightened. 30 years my family's watered our cattle from that creek. My father broke this ground. There was no survey error." "No," Eleanor said. "There wasn't. He manufactures errors. He manufactures confusion. And then he offers to clear up the confusion in exchange for whatever piece of your operation he wants." She paused. "I've seen it done before. Different state, different man, same method." Pete Garrity looked at her. "You're 27 years old," he said. Not unkindly, almost like he was just stating a fact that required acknowledgement. 27, and I've watched this exact thing destroy my family's farm," Eleanor said. "Which means I know what it looks like from the beginning, while there's still time to do something about it." Silence. The Wyoming afternoon sat heavy and hot around them. "What are you proposing?" Pete said. "First," Eleanor said, "we compare documents, all of us. Our deeds, our water rights, our original surveys, side by side, where we can see the full picture. Because I suspect that when you see everything together, the pattern Caldwell is using will become very clear and very provable." She looked at him steadily. "Second, we decide together what to do with that pattern. I'm not here to run this. I'm here because I won't survive it alone, and neither will you, and I think we both know that." The sun moved. A horse shifted in the corral. Pete Garrity uncrossed his arms. "All right," he said. "When?" "Saturday," Eleanor said. "My place. Bring the Sullivans and the Beckers if you're willing to speak to them. Bring whatever records you have." He nodded slowly. "I'll be there," he said. Eleanor drove Gideon back toward the valley as the sun was going low, and she felt the thing that had been building in her chest since she'd found the damaged fence that morning shift and change shape. Still urgent, Still serious, but no longer quite so much like fear. More like purpose. She had not come here only for herself. She understood that now. When she got back, Caleb was there. He'd waited, which he hadn't said he'd do, and which she hadn't asked him to do, and which she found she was not annoyed by, which surprised her a little. "He'll come," she said. Caleb exhaled something that wasn't quite a word. "Good," he said. She told him about the meeting she'd proposed. He listened to all of it with his hands on the fence rail and his eyes on the middle distance. "You're not just fighting for your land," he said when she'd finished. "No," she said. "I don't think I was ever just fighting for my land." He looked at her then, and the evening light was flat and honest across his face, and he had the expression of a man who had just understood something he'd been working toward for a while. "Margaret would have done the same thing," he said quietly. Eleanor heard the weight in that, the full, complicated weight of it. "Tell me about her," Eleanor said. And something in Caleb Walker loosened. He talked about Margaret for the first time since she'd died. Not much, not everything, but some. The way she'd kept accounts. The way she'd fought with the land agent over their property line and won because she'd been right, and she'd known she was right, and she'd refused to act as if she wasn't. The way she'd had her own opinions about everything from livestock management to which mountains were prettiest at sunset, and had held those opinions without apology. Eleanor listened to all of it. When he was done, they were quiet for a while in the fading August light. "She sounds like someone worth grieving," Eleanor said. "Yes," Caleb said, "and worth remembering." He looked at her. "I'm starting to think so," he said. And the way he said it, careful and honest and slightly raw, told Eleanor that this was new. That remembering Margaret without the weight of guilt dragging it down was something he had not allowed himself yet, or had not been able to, and that something in the last months had made it possible. She didn't say anything to that. Some things didn't need a response. They just needed to be witnessed. The stars were coming out over the mountains. "You should go home," she said. "Long day tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She watched him ride out for the second time and stood at the gate for the second time and looked at the mountains for a while. Then she went inside. She had letters to write to the county land office, requesting copies of the original survey records for her parcel and the neighboring parcels. She'd learned from her father's disaster that you had to understand the legal landscape as well as the physical one, and she'd been meaning to request those records since the summer started. She would not be meaning to anymore. She pulled out paper and ink and sat at the small table in the warm cabin with the lantern casting its steady circle of light. And she wrote with the careful precision of a woman who understood that in certain fights, paper was more powerful than any other weapon. Outside, somewhere in the dark valley, water moved steadily out of the spring that sat on her 60 acres and fed the creek that 3 of Richard Caldwell's pastures depended on. Caldwell knew what that spring was worth. Eleanor was learning. The difference was that Eleanor was faster than Caldwell expected, and she was not going to stop. The letters came back from the county land office on a Friday, 12 days after Eleanor had sent them. She was in the field when Caleb rode up with the packet. He'd stopped in town that morning for feed supplies and collected her mail from the postal counter, the way he'd taken to doing without either of them making a formal arrangement about it. The kind of practical accommodation that had grown up between them like the crops, quietly and with purpose. She stripped off her work gloves and took the packet and opened it standing right there in the field because she was not a woman who could wait until she got inside. There were 7 documents: survey records, property descriptions, water rights filings going back to 1871. She read through all of them standing in the August heat with Caleb watching her face. She got to the 4th document and stopped. She went back and read it again. Then she looked up. "Caleb," she said, and her voice had gone very quiet in the way it did when she was thinking hard and fast. "The original survey of this valley, the 1871 survey. Who commissioned it?" He frowned. "The territorial government. Standard land office procedure for—" "Who signed it?" she said. "Look at the signature on this document." He took it from her and looked. The surveyor's name was Thomas Aldridge. Caleb's frown deepened. "I know that name. Aldridge and Associates," Eleanor said. "Land survey firm out of Cheyenne. Currently operating under contract with. She pulled out the second document. Caldwell Land and Cattle Company, since 1879. The silence between them had weight. He's been using the same surveyor for 8 years, Caleb said slowly. The same surveyor who did the original territorial surveys, Eleanor said. Which means when Caldwell's lawyer shows up and tells Pete Garrity there's an error in the original survey, Caldwell already knows exactly what that error says, because the man who wrote the survey works for him. Caleb looked at the document again. Then he looked at Eleanor. That's not just land pressure, he said. That's fraud. That's fraud, she confirmed. And it's been going on for at least 8 years across this entire county. She took the documents back and held them carefully, the way you held something that mattered. When Pete Garrity comes Saturday, I need him to bring every communication he's had from Caldwell's lawyer. Every letter, every recorded visit. He won't have kept all of it, Caleb said. He'll have kept more than he thinks, Eleanor said. People keep things. They don't always know why, but they keep them. She was right. Saturday morning, Pete Garrity arrived first, before 9, with a battered leather satchel under his arm and his wife Clara beside him, which Eleanor hadn't expected, and which she found she was glad of. Clara Garrity was a small, sharp-eyed woman who said almost nothing, but listened with the particular focused attention of someone who was cataloging everything for later use. The Sullivans came 20 minutes after. Tom Sullivan and his eldest son Daniel, 17 and serious-faced, in a way that suggested he understood more of what was happening than adults typically assumed teenagers did. They brought a wooden box with a latch. The Beckers were last. Frank Becker alone, without his wife, who was unwell, and with the expression of a man who had debated with himself most of the week about whether to come, and had decided at the last possible moment to stop being afraid. Eleanor had set up a table outside with the documents spread across it in order. She offered coffee, and she meant the offer, but she didn't make a long social event of it because time mattered and everyone there knew it. I want to show you something, she said, and she walked them through the survey connection the same way she'd worked it out herself. The 1871 documents, the Aldridge signature, the current contract with Caldwell Land and Cattle. She laid it out plainly, without dramatizing it, because the facts were dramatic enough on their own. When she finished, Tom Sullivan put both hands flat on the table and stared at the documents. Son of a... He stopped himself, glanced at Eleanor, and redirected. 30 years, he said. My father homesteaded this valley 30 years ago. You're telling me the survey that defined his water rights was done by a man who ended up in Caldwell's pocket. I'm telling you the survey was done by a man who later went into Caldwell's pocket, Eleanor said carefully. Whether the 1871 survey itself was corrupted, or whether Caldwell simply realized the advantage of having Aldridge on retainer so he could reinterpret existing surveys. That's what we need to determine. Either way, the conflict of interest is real and it's documentable. Frank Becker, who had been quiet, said, Documentable how? We go to the county clerk with this and Caldwell's got 2 lawyers and we've got... He gestured at the table. A pile of papers. We go to the county clerk, Eleanor said, with this, and with every piece of documentation every person at this table has of every communication from Caldwell or his representatives. Every letter, every visit, written down with a date and what was said. Every incident of fence damage or water interference or livestock trouble. All of it together, presented as a pattern. She looked around the table. One person shows up at the clerk's office with a complaint. It looks like a dispute. 5 people show up with documented evidence of systematic fraud. It looks like what it is. Clara Garrity spoke for the first time. What does it look like? She said. Her voice was dry and precise. It looks like a man who's been stealing from this valley for 8 years, Eleanor said. And it looks like we can prove it. The silence that followed was different from the silences Eleanor had been navigating all summer. It was not hostile. It was not skeptical. It was the silence of people who had been holding something alone for a long time, suddenly understanding they didn't have to keep holding it alone. Frank Becker opened his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. Letters, he said. Going back 14 months. I kept them because... He stopped. I don't know why I kept them. I just did. Tom Sullivan opened the wooden box. Inside were more letters, a ledger page, and a document that made Eleanor's breath catch when she unfolded it. It was a copy of a water rights filing from 1883, with handwritten notations in the margin that were not in the same handwriting as the filing itself. "Where did you get this?" she said. "My father's things," Tom said. "He died in March. When I went through his papers, I found it." He paused. "I didn't know what the notations meant. I still don't." Eleanor looked at the notations carefully. Then she passed the document to Caleb. He studied it for a long moment. "These are corrections," he said. "Somebody went through this filing after the fact and marked what the actual boundary measurements were." He looked up. "Somebody knew the filed measurements were wrong." "Aldridge," Eleanor said. "Or someone in his office," Caleb said. "Someone had a conscience," Pete Garrity said. It was the first time he'd spoken in 20 minutes, and when he said it, there was something raw in his voice. Anger. But underneath the anger, something older. Something that had been waiting a long time to be named. They spent the next 3 hours going through everything. Eleanor organized. Clara Garrity wrote. Daniel Sullivan turned out to have a methodical mind and an eye for dates, and Eleanor set him to building a timeline of incidents across all 4 properties that made the pattern visible in a way that would be impossible to dismiss. By noon, the table held something that had not existed that morning. A record. A complete, documented, cross-referenced record of Richard Caldwell's operations in this valley going back 8 years. It was not perfect. There were gaps. There were incidents that had no witnesses and communications that had never been written down. But it was enough. Eleanor knew what enough looked like. She had been calculating minimums all summer. She looked at the people around her table and felt something she hadn't felt since she'd driven away from her father's farm in Missouri, with a deed in her bag and Gideon pulling the wagon. The feeling that the thing she was doing was right. Not just necessary, not just stubborn, but genuinely right, in the way that very few things in her experience had been allowed to be. "I'll go to the county clerk," she said. "I'll take the full package. I'll request a formal review of the water rights surveys across all 4 properties." She paused. "But I need authorization from each of you to represent your documentation in this filing. Your names need to be on it." Frank Becker looked at his hands. "If Caldwell finds out before the clerk acts on it," he said carefully, "he's going to come at all of us harder." "Yes," Eleanor said. "He is." Nobody spoke. She waited. Frank raised his eyes. "My daughter was born on that land," he said. "My wife's buried there." A beat. "All right, put my name on it." Tom Sullivan put his hand on the table. "Sullivan." Pete Garrity looked at Clara. She gave him one small, decisive nod. "Garrity," he said. Eleanor looked around the table one more time. "I'll file Monday morning," she said. Caldwell moved first. Eleanor had expected this was possible. She had not expected it to happen within 48 hours of the meeting, which meant Caldwell had someone watching her property, or someone who'd seen the gathering of neighbors and reported back. And that was a piece of information she filed away immediately because it told her something important about how deep his reach went in this valley. It was the following Monday, before she could get to town to file, that she found the notice. It was tacked to her fence post. A formal-looking document, not handwritten, but printed, which meant it had been prepared in advance, claiming that Eleanor's parcel had a defect in the original deed filing, and that the land office was requiring her to appear and verify her claim within 30 days, or the parcel would revert to unregistered status. Eleanor stood at the fence post and read it twice. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not, quite. But she was not interested in what her heart was doing right now. She pulled the notice off the post and took it inside and read it a 3rd time at the table. It was Caldwell. The official language, the manufactured urgency, the impossible timeline. All of it had the shape of Gerald Holt's maneuvering in Kansas City, and she recognized it the way you recognized a disease that had already killed someone you loved. She rode to town, not to Caleb first, to the county land office. The clerk was a man named Albert Morse, who wore sleeve garters and had the careful, slightly startled look of a man who spent most of his time with paper and found human beings somewhat unpredictable. Eleanor put the notice on his desk. "I received this morning," she said. "I would like to know when this review was requested, who requested it, and what the specific defect in my filing is alleged to be." Albert Morse looked at the notice. Something flickered across his face. "Miss Whitaker," he said carefully, "this notice, where exactly did you find it?" "On my fence post," she said. He looked at the notice again. He turned it over. He looked at the reverse side. "This office," he said slowly, "did not issue this document." Eleanor went very still. "I beg your pardon?" she said. "The format is similar to our official notices," Albert Morse said, and now his voice had gone thin and precise in a way that suggested he was very uncomfortable and working hard to be accurate regardless. "But this seal," he pointed to the stamp in the corner, "is not our current seal. We changed the seal in January. This is the old format." "Someone forged it," Eleanor said. Albert Morse set the document down. He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "I think you should sit down, and I think you should tell me everything." She told him everything. She told him about the fence, the survey connection, the meeting Saturday, the 14 months of Becker's letters, and the Sullivan water rights filing with the marginal notations. She laid it out the same way she'd laid it out for her neighbors, plainly, in order, without embellishment. Albert Morse listened. He was very quiet when she finished. "The Aldridge survey connection," he said. I've had concerns about some of the survey records in this county. I didn't have," he stopped. "I didn't have enough to act on." "You have enough now," Eleanor said, "or you will on Monday when I bring you the full documentation package from all 4 families." He looked at her. "Whoever forged that notice," she said, "wanted me frightened enough to come in here and show my hand before I was ready. They didn't anticipate that I'd ask the right questions." She paused. "Which tells me Caldwell doesn't know what I have yet. He's trying to find out." Albert Morse straightened the document on his desk. "Monday," he said. "I'll be here at 8. Eleanor rode out of town faster than she'd ridden in. She went to Caleb, not because she needed to be rescued, because he was her partner in this now, whether either of them had formally named it that way, and he needed to know what had happened before Caldwell made his next move. She found him in his barn and told him about the forged notice in 3 sentences. He went very still. "He forged a land office document," Caleb said. "Yes." "That's federal territory, Eleanor. That's not a county dispute anymore." "I know," she said. "And Albert Morse knows it too. That's the first genuinely good piece of news I've had since the fence went down." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "You're not frightened," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation, more like something he was working out. "I'm terrified," she said, which was not something she said easily, and the honesty of it cost her, and she said it anyway, because Caleb Walker had earned her honesty. But being frightened and being stopped are 2 entirely different things. He nodded once. "What do you need?" he said. "I need to get to Pete Garrity and the Sullivans and Frank Becker before Caldwell does," she said. "He's going to realize his notice didn't work, and when he does, he'll move to whatever the next pressure point is. I need everyone to know to expect it, and to document everything that happens, and to not react in a way that gives him grounds to make complaints against any of us." "All right," Caleb said. "You take Garrity and Sullivan. I'll ride to Becker." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "Eleanor," he said, with that flat, calm certainty that she'd come to recognize as the most genuine thing about him. "I'm already in this." She nodded. She turned to leave and he said, "Wait." She turned back. He crossed the barn in 4 strides and held out his hand. In his palm was a folded piece of paper. "I went through Margaret's things last month," he said, "looking for something else. I found this." He paused. She'd been keeping notes about the water on our property, about how the creek flow had changed. She'd written down dates and volumes. She was methodical like that. He paused again. "The notes go back 4 years before she died. They show the change in the creek starting in 1878. Eleanor unfolded the paper. Margaret Walker's handwriting was small and even and absolutely clear. The dates aligned exactly with when Caldwell had acquired the Hendricks parcel on the northern ridge. She knew something was wrong with the water, Eleanor said. She didn't know it was Caldwell, Caleb said. But she knew something was wrong. She was trying to document it. He was quiet for a moment. I should have looked at this years ago. I didn't look because I didn't look. Eleanor looked at the paper in her hand. Margaret Walker had been doing exactly what Eleanor was doing 6 years ago, without knowing why the water was changing or who was responsible, documenting it with careful precision because she was a woman who understood that evidence mattered. She had died before she could do anything with it. Eleanor's throat tightened in a way she did not let go any further. "This is evidence," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "This goes in this package on Monday." "Yes," he said again. She looked up at him. There was something in his face that she could only call grief, but it was not the closed, heavy grief she'd seen in him before. It was something open, something that hurt in the way healing hurt, which was real and necessary and better than the alternative. "She didn't finish it," he said quietly. "But maybe it finishes now." Eleanor folded the paper carefully. "It finishes now," she said. Caldwell's next move came 3 days later, and it was not subtle. She'd known it wouldn't be. She'd told everyone to expect escalation, and she'd been right. And being right was not the comfort it should have been, because the form the escalation took was not what she'd anticipated. It was not another fence cut. It was not another forged document. It was a man named Luther Hayes, who rode out to her property on a Wednesday afternoon and introduced himself as Caldwell's land agent, and then, without any pretense at pleasantness, told her that Caldwell was offering $700 for her 60 acres, which was more than the land was worth by anyone's honest assessment, and that the offer would not be on the table after Friday. Eleanor looked at Luther Hayes. He was a tall man, professionally dressed, with the careful blankness of someone who delivered bad news and good news with the same affect and had stopped distinguishing between them. "Tell Mr. Caldwell I'm not selling," she said. "Miss Whitaker," Hayes said, in the tone of a man who had made this speech before. "I want to be direct with you. Mr. Caldwell is a patient man, but he is also a thorough man. Matters regarding the water access in this valley are going to be resolved one way or another. You could resolve it favorably, with $700, or you could find yourself in a position where the resolution is less." "Mr. Hayes," Eleanor said, "I want to be direct with you. I filed a documentation package with the county land office 2 days ago containing evidence of fraudulent survey manipulation and a forged land office notice that was left on my property last week. Albert Morse has begun a formal review." She paused. "The offer Mr. Caldwell is making is not going to improve his position in that review. In fact, the fact that he's making it within 72 hours of my filing may itself be relevant to that review." Luther Hayes went very still. "I don't know what you think he started. "I think I've documented 8 years of systematic fraud," Eleanor said evenly. "I think I have 5 neighbors who have done the same. I think I have a water rights timeline that goes back to 1878, written in the hand of a woman who is now deceased, which raises questions that I think a federal land examiner is going to find very interesting." She held his gaze. "You tell Mr. Caldwell that I hope the $700 was not the last offer he intended to make in good faith, because it was the last one I intend to receive." Hayes said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode out without another word. Eleanor stood in the yard until he was out of sight. Then she went inside and sat down at her table and pressed her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She let them shake. She looked at them shaking, and she thought, "This is what courage is, not the absence of fear, but the decision to continue while the fear runs through you, like water through a creek, fast and cold and not stopping." She pressed her hands flat until they steadied. Then she got up and went back to work. Caleb came by that evening, which had become the rhythm of their days. Not every day, but often enough that his absence was notable, and his presence was something she did not examine too carefully for what it meant, only for what it was, which was steady and real. She told him about Hayes. He listened to all of it, and then he said, "You told him about Margaret's notes." "Yes," she said. "He'll tell Caldwell." "I know. Caldwell will want to know what the notes say, whether they're actually what you implied they are." "They're better than what I implied they are," Eleanor said. Caleb nodded slowly. "Eleanor," he said, "Caldwell is not going to let this sit. He's invested too much in this valley over 8 years. If he realizes the full picture of what you've assembled, he's going to come at you in a way that makes everything else look like fence posts." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "You need to be somewhere safe while the review is in progress. You can't be out here alone if—" "I'm not leaving my land," she said. Not loud, not heated. The flatness of it was like a wall. Caleb stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. "I wasn't going to suggest you leave your land," he said carefully. "I was going to suggest that maybe you shouldn't be on it alone." Eleanor heard the difference. It was a meaningful difference. She was quiet. Outside, the August night was settling around the cabin. The specific quiet of mountain dark, punctuated by the creek sound and the occasional shift of Gideon in the small corral she'd built. "You could move your operation down here temporarily," she said. "Your foreman can handle the ranch for a few weeks." "Yes," he said. "As a practical security measure," she said. "Yes," he said again, with the smallest possible indication of something almost like a smile. "I'm not—" she started, and then she stopped, because she was not entirely sure what she was not, and she had learned this summer that imprecision was a thing to be avoided. "I know," Caleb said quietly. "Eleanor, I know." They sat on the step of the cabin in the dark for a while. "She would have liked you," Caleb said. Eleanor didn't ask who. She knew. "I think," she said carefully, "I would have liked her too." He nodded. They sat in the quiet together, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was, as it had been from the beginning, not uncomfortable, not empty, just room to breathe. In the morning, Caleb would move his bedroll to the barn. Eleanor would ride out and check the fence line and find it intact, which would not reassure her as much as it would have a month ago, because she understood by now that Caldwell's next move would not be a fence. She had a county clerk with an open review file. She had 4 families standing together with documentation. She had Margaret Walker's handwritten notes that went back to 1878. She had a mountain cowboy who had chosen, clearly and without ceremony, to stand beside her. And she had 60 acres of Wyoming land with a spring in the middle of it, and the deed was in her name, and the cabin was built with her own hands, and nobody, not Richard Caldwell, not a forged notice, not $700, not the weight of everything that had been done to her family or to herself across all the hard years, was going to change that. The creek ran on in the dark. The mountains held the stars the way they always did, indifferent and vast, and entirely unbothered by the small, urgent human lives moving around at their feet. And somewhere down the valley, a light burned in a window that had been dark for 11 years. It was not going out. Caleb moved his bedroll to the barn on a Thursday, and by Saturday morning, it felt like he'd been there longer than 2 days. Not because he changed anything. That was the thing Eleanor noticed first and kept noticing. He didn't rearrange, didn't take over, didn't start making decisions about her property as if proximity had granted him authority. He woke before she did and had the fire going and the coffee on, and the first morning she came out and found it done. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the cup sitting ready on the stove and felt something complicated move through her that she didn't name. She just picked up the cup and drank the coffee and went to work. The county review had been open for 4 days. Albert Morse had sent a letter confirming receipt of the full documentation package and informing her that he had contacted the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne to request the presence of a federal examiner. The letter was formal and careful, and between its careful lines, Eleanor could read the controlled urgency of a man who had found what he'd been afraid to look for. She kept the letter in the tin box with the deed. She kept the tin box within arm's reach at all times. The valley had gone quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like held breath. She told Caleb this on the Saturday morning, standing at the fence with their coffee, watching Gideon move around the corral with the self-satisfied energy of an animal that had decided he'd earned his rest. "Caldwell's waiting," Caleb said. "For what?" "To see if Morse backs down." He paused. "Or if you do." "Morse won't back down," Eleanor said. "He's got the forged document. That's not a county matter anymore. It's a territorial matter, and he knows it. If he looks the other way now, he's complicit." "And you won't back down," Caleb said, and it was not a question. "No," she said. He nodded once, and they stood in the quiet for another moment, and then Eleanor said, "What is Caldwell like? In person? You've met him." Caleb thought about it. He was a man who thought before he spoke, which she'd come to rely on. His answers were worth waiting for. "He's the kind of man," Caleb said slowly, "who is genuinely convinced he's doing people a favor by taking things from them. He believes he manages land better than small farmers. He believes it honestly." A pause. "That makes him more dangerous than a man who knows he's wrong. Men who know they're wrong can be shamed. Men who believe they're right have to be stopped by evidence," Eleanor said. "Yes." She finished her coffee. "Then we'd better make sure the evidence is unassailable," she said, and went back to work. The first sign that Caldwell had changed his approach came on a Monday, and it came not through Luther Hayes or forged documents or damaged fences, but through the most ordinary possible channel: gossip. Eleanor went to town for supplies and found the atmosphere changed. It was subtle. The way a room's temperature drops before a storm. You don't feel the cold exactly, you feel the absence of warmth. Martha Hicks was polite but brief. Two men she passed on the street looked away before she could nod to them. At the grain merchant's, a conversation stopped when she walked in and restarted after she'd made her purchase and left. She drove Gideon home with her back very straight and her expression entirely neutral, and when she got home, she sat at the table and thought about what she'd observed and what it meant. Caldwell was working the town, not with threats, with narrative. He was telling a story about Eleanor Whitaker, and the story was designed to make people in Red Willow decide, slowly and on their own, that she was a problem rather than a neighbor. It was the same tactic Gerald Holt had used against her father. Not attack, but erosion. Make the person seem unreasonable. Make their fight seem personal rather than principled. Make the community pull back, so when the final pressure came, the target was already isolated. Eleanor understood the tactic completely, which meant she had to move faster than it. She went to see Nora Finch. This surprised her, in retrospect, more than it surprised Nora. She had not planned it when she left the house, but she was driving back through town, and she passed the Finch house, and on some instinct, she pulled Gideon to a stop and climbed down and knocked on the door. Nora answered it with an expression that suggested she'd been expecting a different visitor and was recalibrating quickly. "Eleanor," she said. "Mrs. Finch," Eleanor said. "I need 20 minutes and your honest opinion of what people in this town are saying about me this week." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "I just made tea." Nora Finch's front room was everything Eleanor would have predicted. Precise, comfortable, every object in its considered place. And the woman herself, sitting across the tea table with her hands folded and her expression unreadable, was more complicated than Eleanor had given her credit for. "He's been talking to people," Nora said, without preamble. "Caldwell, not himself. He wouldn't do it himself. But someone's been suggesting to certain people in town that you went to the land office to cause trouble, that you've been organizing the Valley families against Caldwell out of some personal grievance, that you're— the word being used is unstable." Eleanor felt the particular cold anger of hearing a precise word chosen to do maximum damage. "Unstable," she said. "A woman alone," Nora said, "grieving, imagining conspiracies." She said it the way you'd say a line from a script, to demonstrate the script, not to perform it. That's the version being told. "And what does Red Willow think of that version?" Eleanor said. Nora was quiet for a moment. "Some people," she said carefully, "are inclined to believe what's easy to believe. Caldwell's been here for 20 years. He employs men from this town. He sits on the church building committee. She paused. But some people have been watching you work for 4 months, and they know the difference between a woman who's unstable and a woman who's determined. Those are not the same thing, and most people over 50 can tell them apart. Eleanor looked at her. You've been defending me, she said. Nora's chin came up slightly. I've been correcting inaccurate information where I've encountered it. That is a different thing. It's the same thing, Eleanor said, not unkindly. Nora's chin stayed up for another moment, and then something relaxed. My husband, she said quietly. The one I told you. I didn't tell you, but Caleb implied. She stopped. When he was making my life difficult, nobody in this town said a word in my favor. Not one person. Because he was established. He employed men. He sat on committees. She looked at Eleanor directly. I know what it is to have a true thing called unstable. I have some strong feelings about it. Eleanor set her teacup down. Mrs. Finch, she said, there's going to be a meeting, in this town, within the next 2 weeks. A federal examiner is coming from Cheyenne because of what I filed with Albert Morse. When that examiner arrives, the things he finds are going to change this valley. But before he arrives, I need this town to understand what he's going to find, and why, and what it means for every family here. Not just the 4 families who signed the documentation. She paused. Will you help me organize that meeting? Nora Finch looked at her for a long time. The Ladies' Auxiliary Meeting Hall holds 60 people, she said. That'll do, Eleanor said. Nora picked up her teacup. Thursday evening, she said. 7 o'clock. I'll get the word out. Eleanor stood to leave and Nora said, Eleanor. She turned. Whatever happens with the examiner, Nora said. Whatever Caldwell does next, you should know that you are not alone in this town. Some of us have been watching you since April. Some of us have been proud of you, I suppose, is the honest word. She said it as if pride were a slightly embarrassing emotion, which Eleanor understood completely. It seemed important to say that. Eleanor felt something move through her that was too old and complicated for a simple name. Thank you, she said. That means more than you know. She drove home and told Caleb about Nora Finch and the Thursday meeting. And he listened with his characteristic stillness and then said, You're taking this public before Caldwell expected you to. He's already made it public, Eleanor said. He just told his version first. I intend to tell mine. Caleb nodded slowly. He won't like that, he said. Good, said Eleanor. Caldwell made his next move on Wednesday. Luther Hayes came back, but this time he brought a man Eleanor didn't recognize. A younger man in a dark coat who had attorney written across him the way some men had soldier written across them. Something in the posture, the precision. They arrived at the property while Caleb was there, which Eleanor suspected was not coincidental. Hayes introduced the attorney as a Mr. Aldridge. Eleanor went very still. Aldridge, she said. My nephew, Hayes said, with a careful blandness that told her he knew exactly what the name meant and had brought it deliberately. Charles Aldridge. He's been assisting Mr. Caldwell with the Land Office review. Charles Aldridge was perhaps 30, with a smooth, untroubled face that had probably never held an expression it hadn't chosen deliberately. He looked at Eleanor with professional neutrality. Miss Whitaker, he said, I'm here to discuss the documentation you filed with the county clerk, specifically, several items in that filing that may have been obtained or represented in ways that could complicate the review. Eleanor looked at him. Such as? She said. The survey records you obtained from the county archive were requested under a general records inquiry, not as part of any formal proceeding, Aldridge said. Their use as evidence in a fraud claim may not be. Mr. Aldridge, Eleanor said, your name is the same as the name on those surveys. He didn't blink. Thomas Aldridge was my uncle, who currently works under contract with Caldwell Land and Cattle. Worked, Aldridge said smoothly. My uncle retired from active practice in 1884. After completing the survey amendments that form the basis of Mr. Caldwell's water rights claims in this valley, Eleanor said. A beat of silence. Caleb had not moved from where he was standing near the fence. He was watching Aldridge the way a man watches something he is not sure is dangerous yet, but intends to be ready for. Miss Whitaker, Aldridge said, and his voice had shifted slightly. Still professional, but the smoothness had a different quality now, less natural, more applied. Mr. Caldwell is prepared to offer not $700, but $1,000 for your property. He's also prepared to offer 5-year water access agreements to the Garrity, Sullivan, and Becker families at favorable rates. These are generous terms. They're panic terms, Eleanor said. Aldridge's expression didn't change, but Hayes, behind him, looked at the ground briefly, and that involuntary small motion told Eleanor everything she needed to know about where Caldwell's confidence level was right now. "The federal examiner," she said. "He's already been contacted. He's already reviewing the documentation. That's why you're here today with $1,000 instead of $700. And that's why you brought a man named Aldridge to tell me the survey records might be inadmissible. You're trying to find the crack before the examination begins." Aldridge opened his mouth. "There isn't one," Eleanor said. "Tell Mr. Caldwell there isn't one." Hayes touched Aldridge's arm briefly, and they turned and walked back to their horses, and Eleanor stood in the yard and watched them ride out and did not move until they were gone. Then she turned to Caleb. "He's panicking," she said. "A man doesn't send his lawyer's nephew to offer $1,000 unless he's panicking," Caleb agreed. "What did you mean there isn't a crack? You seemed very certain." "I am very certain," Eleanor said. "Because yesterday I wrote out every piece of documentation we have and every possible challenge to each piece. And I answered every challenge. And there is not one item in that package that requires the original survey records to hold up." Margaret's notes alone establish the timeline of water diversion independently of any survey. The forged notice is independently provable. The pattern of identical tactics across 4 properties is independently provable. She paused. "He can discredit Thomas Aldridge entirely, and the case still stands." Caleb looked at her. "When did you do all of this?" he said. "Tuesday night," she said. "I didn't sleep much." He was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was different. Not the working partner voice, not the steady practical voice, but something less armored. "I need to say something to you." She looked at him. "I've been thinking," he said, and stopped. He tried again. "The night you told me about your father, about the courtroom in Kansas City, about the promise you made him." She waited. "I understand now," he said, "what you're doing here. Not just the land, not just the spring. You're finishing something that got taken from your family. You're closing a wound that's been open for years." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that I understand what that means, and that I'm not standing beside you out of anything other than the fact that you are the most genuinely good person I have met in longer than I can honestly remember. And this is a right thing, and I want to be part of it." Eleanor looked at him. In her experience, men spoke like that for one of 2 reasons. Because they wanted something in return, or because they meant it. She had learned to tell the difference, though it had cost her to learn it. This was the second kind. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "There's something else," he said. She waited. I think I'd like to tell you something I haven't told anyone." He was choosing words with even more than his usual care. "After Margaret died, I went through a period where I blamed myself for not getting the doctor sooner, for not doing something different, something I could never quite identify but believed existed." He stopped. "I carried that for 6 years. It's a heavy thing to carry." Eleanor said nothing. She let him find his way. "This summer," he said, "watching you work, watching you build something out of nothing on land everyone said was impossible, the way you refuse to let what's been done to you become the reason you stop." He paused. "I've started to think that some things that go wrong aren't because someone failed to prevent them. Some things just go wrong. And the measure of a person isn't that they stopped it, it's what they do with the space after." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's exactly right." "I'm not entirely sure I believe it yet," he said. "But I'm starting to." "That's enough," she said. "Starting is enough." They stood in the afternoon air, and the valley moved around them the way it always did. The creek, The wind off the ridge. Gideon's occasional opinion about nothing in particular. And it was ordinary, and it was everything. The Thursday meeting filled the ladies' auxiliary hall, and then overflowed it. Eleanor hadn't expected the overflow. She'd thought 60 people was ambitious. There were closer to 90, crowded into the room and spilling out the door, and the faces in the room were not exclusively sympathetic. There were men in there who worked for Caldwell's operation, men who had reasons to prefer the current order of things, and Eleanor saw them and didn't look away. She stood at the front of the room with the documentation on the table beside her, and she told the story. Not her story. The Valley's story. She started with the 1871 surveys, and she walked forward through time, methodically and specifically, showing the pattern of water rights manipulation and fraudulent survey amendments and manufactured legal confusion that had operated in this county for 8 years. She showed Margaret Walker's notes, and when she held up that document and said whose handwriting it was, she heard the room shift. A physical thing. 60 people adjusting to a new weight. She showed the forged notice. She showed the correlation between Aldridge survey dates and Caldwell property acquisitions. She showed the timeline Daniel Sullivan had built, which covered all 4 properties across 8 years in a single document that made the pattern impossible to misread. She spoke for 40 minutes without stopping. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Then a man in the back, one of Caldwell's ranch hands, Eleanor was almost certain, said, "You're saying Caldwell's a criminal." "I'm saying the evidence shows systematic fraud in the water rights records of this county," Eleanor said. "The federal examiner arriving from Cheyenne next week will make the determination about what that constitutes legally. I'm showing you the evidence so that when the examination happens, the people of this town understand what they're seeing and why. And if the examiner sides with Caldwell," someone else said, "then he sides with forged documents and a surveyor working for the man whose claims he's certifying," Eleanor said. "And that becomes part of the record too." Another silence. Pete Garrity, from the middle of the room, said, "I've watered my cattle from that creek for 30 years. My father broke that ground before I was born. Caldwell's lawyer came to my door and told me a man who works for Caldwell decided my father's water rights were filed wrong." He paused. "I should have come to this meeting years ago. I should have talked to my neighbors years ago. I didn't, because I was handling it alone, and that was a mistake. And I want to say that plainly, because I think some other people in this room have been making the same mistake." The room moved again. Nora Finch, who had been sitting in the front row with her hands folded and her expression unreadable for the entire 40 minutes, turned to look at the room behind her. "I believe," she said, in the carrying voice of a woman who had run meetings for 20 years, "that what Miss Whitaker is telling us deserves to be heard. I believe the examiner deserves to arrive in a county that has already examined itself." A pause. "I also believe that Richard Caldwell is going to be very unhappy about this meeting, which I confess I find somewhat satisfying." Laughter. Genuine laughter, from 90 people who had been holding their breath. Eleanor felt it move through the room and felt something loosen in her own chest. Caldwell came to her property the next morning. Not Hayes, not Aldridge, not a representative. Caldwell himself, which told Eleanor that the meeting had done exactly what she'd intended it to do, and that it had done it faster than she'd expected. How was a large man? Broader than she'd expected from his reputation, with gray in his hair and the ease of movement of someone who had never had to doubt whether a room would make space for him. He rode up to the fence and looked at the cabin and the fields and the creek, and he looked at it all with the patient assessment of a man who had been calculating the value of things his entire life. He looked at Eleanor. He didn't look at Caleb, who was standing beside the barn with his thumbs in his belt and his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Whitaker," Caldwell said, "I thought it was time we spoke directly." "I've been available for direct conversation since April," Eleanor said. "You sent Luther Hayes." Something crossed his face. Not anger, acknowledgement. "I underestimated you," he said, and the honesty in his voice was the most surprising thing he could have offered. "I want to be direct about that." Eleanor said nothing. "I also want to be direct," he said, "that what you filed with Morse has created a situation that is going to be damaging for a great many people in this county. Not only for me, for men who work my operation, For families whose livelihoods depend on— Mr. Caldwell, Eleanor said, I grew up watching a man do exactly what you've done here. He ruined my family with it. He ruined other families. And every time someone questioned him, he talked about the damage that holding him accountable would do to the people around him. She looked at him steadily. The people around him suffered regardless. They just suffered without justice. He studied her. What do you want? He said. I want the water rights in this valley returned to their original survey designations, she said. I want the fraudulent amendments acknowledged and corrected in the county record. I want the Garrity, Sullivan, and Becker families to have clean title to their water access without any future claim from your operation. She paused. I want my 60 acres and my spring left alone. And if I agree to that, then I let the examiner's investigation complete its process without further escalation from my side. And if I don't? Then I let the examiner's investigation complete its process, she said. The difference is whether you're part of the solution or part of the record. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Eleanor heard the creak and Gideon moving in the corral, and somewhere on the ridge a hawk making its efficient sound. You have no interest in destroying me, Caldwell said slowly. It was not quite a question. I have no interest in you at all, Eleanor said, which was the most honest thing she could have told him. I have interest in my land, and my neighbor's land, and the water that runs through this valley. That's the entirety of my interest. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked at the cabin behind her. The walls she'd built log by log, the door she'd hung herself, the roof with Caleb's cedar shingles. And something in his face shifted in a way she couldn't entirely read. My lawyer, he said, will contact Albert Morse on Monday. He turned his horse. Mr. Caldwell, Eleanor said. He looked back. The forged notice, she said. That can't be part of any agreement. That goes to the examiner regardless. His jaw tightened. Yes, he said. I understand. He rode out. Eleanor stood in the yard after he was gone and felt the particular strange emptiness of a confrontation that had ended without the explosion she'd been braced for, which was almost harder to absorb than an explosion would have been. Caleb came to stand beside her. You gave him a way out, he said. I gave him a way to be less wrong, she said. There's no way out of what he's done. But there's a way to stop doing it. Caleb looked at her. He'll take it, Caleb said. I think so, Eleanor said. He's a practical man. He ran the numbers, and the numbers changed when the examiner got involved. Some men wouldn't care, Caleb said. Some men would rather burn everything down than admit they lost. Yes, she said. He's not that kind of man. She paused. He's the kind who convinces himself he's never really lost. He'll reframe this as having made a strategic decision. That's fine. The outcome's what matters. Caleb nodded. They stood together in the yard for a moment. Eleanor, he said. She looked at him. He had his hat in his hands. The same gesture, she realized, that she'd seen in the barn the morning he'd given her Margaret's notes. The hat came off when he was saying something that mattered. I need to ask you something, he said. And I want to preface it by saying that the asking is completely separate from everything that's happening with the land. It's not connected. If the answer is no, everything else stays exactly the same. Eleanor looked at him steadily. Ask, she said. He looked at the hat in his hands. I would like, he said carefully, to continue being part of your life, in a way that is more than a neighbor, more than a working partner. He looked up. I'm not good at this. It's been a long time since I've said anything like this to anyone, so I'm going to say it plainly and trust that you'll take it in the spirit it's offered. I will, she said. I love you, he said. I think I started to from the day I saw you on that roof. I don't need anything from you in return. I'm not asking you to change what you're doing or who you are. I'm asking if you'd be willing to let me be beside it. All of it. Permanently. The Wyoming afternoon held the moment the way a jar holds something valuable, still and clear and careful. Eleanor thought about Charles, who had used silence as a weapon. She thought about Gerald Holt, who had taken her father's land. She thought about every man who had looked at her and seen something to be managed. She thought about cedar shingles, about ridgepoles lifted in perfect unison, about coffee drunk in easy silence, about Margaret's handwriting in the margins of a water rights document, patient and precise, evidence of a woman trying to protect something true. She thought about what it meant that Caleb Walker had given her that document without keeping anything back. "I'm not easy to live beside," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been watching all summer. I have opinions about everything, and I say them. I noticed. I won't stop building. I don't want you to." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He went very still. "Yes," she said again, because it deserved to be said twice. "I'll let you be beside it." Something crossed his face that she had never seen there before. Not the careful neutrality, not the weighted quiet, not even the almost smile. Something unguarded and complete that she thought had probably not been on his face in a very long time. He stepped forward. He took her hand, the one that had bled on the roof beam in April, that wore its scar now like all earned things were worn, and held it in both of his. "Thank you," he said. She looked at their hands. Then she looked at the cabin behind her, and the fields coming in strong and green, and the mountains holding the afternoon light in the particular way they had at this hour. "We should get back to work," she said. He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, a real laugh, surprised out of him, nothing careful about it. And it was the best sound the valley had produced all summer. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He didn't let go of her hand for another moment, and Eleanor, who had come to Wyoming with 60 acres and a deed and a promise to a dying man, stood in the yard of the cabin she had built with her own hands and felt the specific, hard-won, impossible-to-counterfeit feeling of a life that was entirely, finally, her own. She let herself feel it all the way through. Then she went back to work. The federal examiner arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Albert Morse had sent the request to Cheyenne. His name was Warren Dalby, and he came without fanfare, a compact, gray-haired man in a dark coat who stepped off the stage with a single leather satchel and walked directly to the land office without stopping at the hotel first, which told Eleanor everything she needed to know about the kind of man he was. She had positioned herself to see him arrive, not out of anxiety, but out of the same practical instinct that had made her document every incident since the first fence was cut. She needed to see him. She needed to assess him before he assessed anything. She liked what she saw. He moved like a man who was not interested in being watched. That was good. Men who were interested in being watched made different decisions than men who weren't. She gave him one full day before she went to see Albert Morse. Albert Morse met her at the door of the land office with an expression that was trying to be professionally composed and not entirely succeeding. "He's been through the full package twice," Albert said quietly, even though the office was empty. "He asked for the original territorial records going back to 1869. I gave him everything." "And?" Eleanor said. "And he hasn't said anything to me yet," Albert said. "But he asked for a separate meeting with the county sheriff this morning." Eleanor went very still. "The sheriff," she said. "Yes." Albert looked at her. "Miss Whitaker, whatever you've assembled, whatever is in those documents, I think it goes further than we anticipated. Further than even I anticipated when I sent the request to Cheyenne." Eleanor drove back to the valley and told Caleb. He listened with his hands on the fence rail and his eyes on the middle distance. "Further how?" he said. "Albert doesn't know," Eleanor said. "Or he knows and he won't say yet. Either way." She paused, working it out as she spoke. "Either Caldwell's operation in this county is worse than what we documented, or the forgery on that notice connected to something else Dalby recognized. Something from another county, maybe. Another case." Caleb looked at her. "You think this isn't the only valley," he said. Eleanor had been thinking it since Albert said the word sheriff, turning it over the way you turned a stone to see what lived underneath. "I think," she said carefully, "that a man who builds a system like this, a surveyor on retainer, forged documents, manufactured legal confusion, doesn't build it for one valley. He builds it because it works. And things that work get used again. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. If Caldwell's done this in other counties, he said, then what you've filed here is bigger than a water rights dispute. Yes, Eleanor said. That changes his exposure considerably. Yes, she said again. She went inside and sat at the table and looked at the tin box for a while without opening it. Everything she'd assembled was already filed. It was out of her hands in the specific sense that the action was taken and the examiner had it, and the process was moving forward under its own authority now. That was the thing about building a proper case. You spent everything you had to get it to the point where it no longer needed you to hold it up. And then you let go. And the letting go was its own particular kind of discipline. She was good at discipline. She was less practiced at letting go. Warren Dalby came to see her on Thursday. He rode out alone, without Albert Morse, without the sheriff, without anyone. Just the compact gray-haired man on a serviceable bay horse, arriving at her fence line and tying up at the post with the careful efficiency of a man who wasted no motion. Eleanor met him at the gate. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "I'm Warren Dalby. I imagine you know why I'm here." "I imagine I do," she said. "Come in. I have coffee." He sat at her table, the same table where she'd organized documents and written letters and done her accounting by lantern light since April. And he looked around the cabin with the same assessing quality she'd noticed in him at the stage stop, taking in details and filing them without comment. "You built this yourself," he said. It was what everyone said, and she had given the same answer so many times it should have felt routine. But something about this man's tone made it feel different. He was not surprised, not skeptical, simply noting a fact with the precision of someone who dealt in facts professionally. "Yes," she said, "every piece." He nodded once and opened his satchel. He laid 3 documents on the table beside her coffee. Eleanor looked at them. They were not her documents. They were not from her filing. They were survey records from a county she recognized, Laramie County, further east, with the Aldridge signature and the same format as the amended surveys in her package, and they were dated 1882. "These came from our Cheyenne office," Dalby said. "An open investigation that has been moving slowly for lack of a central connection." He looked at her. "Your filing provided the central connection." Eleanor felt the thing she'd anticipated in the abstract become real and present in a way that changed its weight. "How many counties?" she said. "4, Dalby said. "Possibly 5. We're still working the edges of it." He paused. "Mr. Caldwell's operation is the hub. The survey manipulation is the method. Your documentation is the clearest record of the method we have found in 4 years of looking." Eleanor sat with that. "Margaret Walker's notes," she said, "go back further than any other independent record we have of the water diversion," Dalby confirmed. "They're extraordinary. The woman was systematic." She was, Eleanor said, and felt the weight of that. A woman she had never met, dead 6 years, whose careful handwriting in the margin of a water rights document was now the foundation of a territorial fraud case. "Her husband gave them to me." "Yes, I'll want to speak with Mr. Walker." He paused. "I want to speak with all of the families who contributed documentation. I'm told you organized that." "I organized the gathering of it," Eleanor said. "Everyone contributed their own records." Dalby looked at her with the expression of a man who understood the distinction she was drawing and why she was drawing it. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "I want to be direct with you about something." "Please," she said. "What you assembled here, and the manner in which you assembled it, the organization, the cross-referencing, the anticipation of legal challenges, is not what I typically encounter from a private citizen. Most people who come to the land office with fraud complaints come with one piece of evidence and a great deal of anger. You came with a case." He looked at her steadily. "I want to know how you knew to build it that way." Eleanor looked at the documents on her table. "My father," she said. "He lost our family farm to the same type of operation in Kansas. Different man, same method. I watched it happen. I watched what failed and why it failed." She paused. "What failed was that he had truth and he had witnesses and he had nothing else. The other man had lawyers and documents and a story told in advance. She looked at Dalby. I decided a long time ago that if I ever faced the same thing, I would build it differently. Dalby was quiet. How old were you? He said. When my father lost the farm? 17. He nodded slowly. The case will take time, he said. The Caldwell operation is substantial. There will be legal proceedings. You and the other families will be required to testify. Caldwell's lawyers will attempt to challenge the evidence. He paused. I want to be honest with you that it will not be quick, and it will not be easy. I built a cabin alone on land everyone said was worthless, Eleanor said. Mr. Dalby, quick and easy have never been my primary requirements. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. No, he said. I can see that. He finished his coffee and stood. One more question, he said, at the door. Why did you do it? Not the filing, the whole thing. You could have sold when Caldwell first offered. $700 is not nothing for 60 acres of difficult land. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the courtroom in Kansas City. About her father's hands on the drive home, how they'd looked in his lap, just lying there, empty, when they'd always been moving before. She thought about the promise she'd made in the small room above the hardware store. She thought about the deed in the tin box, and the cabin walls, and the door that latched clean. Because he expected me to, she said. And I decided a long time ago to stop doing what men like Caldwell expect me to do. Dalby looked at her for a moment. Good day, Miss Whitaker, he said. Good day, she said. She stood in the doorway and watched him ride out. And then she went back to work because the harvest wasn't finished, and the days weren't getting longer, and the land didn't wait on federal examiners any more than it waited on anything else. Caleb came by that afternoon, and she told him everything, including Dalby's question and her answer, and he listened to all of it the way he always listened, fully, without interrupting, giving it the space it deserved. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 4 counties. At minimum, Eleanor said. Margaret knew something was wrong with the water in 1878, he said slowly. 8 years she's been... He stopped. Eleanor looked at him. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was managing something interior. She knew, he said. She documented it because she knew something was wrong. She just didn't know what she was looking at. She saw what she could see, Eleanor said gently. She did what she could with what she had. And what she did, what she left behind, is what made the difference. Caleb looked at the mountains. I should have looked at those notes years ago, he said, and there it was again, the old guilt, rising. Eleanor had thought about how to handle this moment if it came. She'd thought about it with the same care she'd given the documentation, knowing it would come, knowing what form it was likely to take. Caleb, she said, if you had looked at those notes 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, or even last year, you would have had one set of notes from one property without any of the other documentation. It would have been a widow's handwritten observations that a good lawyer could have set aside in 10 minutes. She paused. It works now because it's part of a complete picture. The timing wasn't a failure. It was the conditions needing to be right. He looked at her. You believe that, he said. I believe that some things require all their pieces to be in place before they can work, she said. Your grief was a piece. Your willingness to finally look in those papers was a piece. Margaret's notes were a piece. My father's farm in Kansas was a piece. She held his gaze. None of it works without all of it. He looked at her for a long time. Then he crossed the space between them and put both arms around her, and Eleanor, who did not typically accept being held, accepted it, not as comfort offered to weakness, but as what it actually was, the recognition, between two people who had both lost enormous things, that they had somehow found their way to the same place, and that the place was solid ground. She let herself lean into it for exactly as long as it deserved. Then she stepped back. We still have the south field to finish, she said. He exhaled something that was not quite a laugh. Yes, ma'am, he said. The legal proceedings moved through the following months with the grinding, incremental pace of institutional processes, which Eleanor had expected and had prepared herself for. There were depositions. There were letters from Caldwell's lawyers raising objections that Albert Morse forwarded to her, and she answered in writing, each time, precisely and without heat. There were 2 visits to Cheyenne, one in October, one in December, where she sat in an official room and answered questions from men with the careful patience of someone who had built the thing they were examining and knew every corner of it. Pete Garrity came to Cheyenne for the December proceeding, and the Sullivans, and Frank Becker, who had brought his daughter this time, a girl of about 12 who sat in the corridor outside the hearing room and read a book with the focused intensity of a child old enough to understand that something important was happening. Eleanor sat beside her in the corridor during the lunch recess and said, "What are you reading?" The girl looked up. "History," she said. "About land." Eleanor looked at this book. It was a history of territorial land grants in the American West, which was an ambitious read for a 12-year-old. "Good book?" Eleanor said. "It's very complicated," the girl said. "But Papa says complicated things are worth understanding." "Your father's right," Eleanor said. The girl considered her. "Are you the lady who found the proof?" she said. Eleanor thought about how to answer that. "I helped organize the proof," she said. "A lot of people contributed to it, including a woman named Margaret Walker, who isn't alive anymore. She started the documentation years before anyone else." The girl thought about this. "So someone who died helped fix it," she said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "That happens sometimes. People do work that matters before they know it matters." The girl nodded, with the grave seriousness of someone filing this information under important. "I'm going to be a lawyer," she said. Eleanor looked at her. "You should," she said. Caldwell's formal settlement with the Territorial Land Office came in February of 1887, which was 10 months after Eleanor had driven Gideon into the valley with her wagon and her tools and her deed. It was not a complete accounting. It never was, in Eleanor's experience. The full weight of what Caldwell had taken from this valley over 8 years could not be entirely restored by a legal proceeding. But it was substantial. The water rights across all 4 properties were returned to their original survey designations. The fraudulent amendments were struck from the county record. Thomas Aldridge's survey practice was formally suspended pending the territorial investigation, which extended to 2 additional counties that Dalby had identified after the December proceeding. Richard Caldwell paid a settlement to the territorial government and agreed to a set of operating restrictions on his water claims that effectively ended his ability to expand his operation in the way he'd been expanding it. He did not go to prison. Eleanor had known he probably wouldn't. She had not built the case for prison. She had built it for the land, for the water, for the record. The record now said what the truth was, permanently and in the official archive, which was exactly what she'd promised her father in that small room in Kansas City. She held the final settlement document in her hands for a long time, sitting at the table in her cabin in February, with the stove throwing good heat and the snow packed against the walls outside. And she felt the thing she'd been carrying since she was 17 years old. The specific cold weight of an injustice she had no power over, shift and change shape, not disappear. Injustice didn't disappear. But it became the past instead of the present, which was a different kind of weight entirely. She folded the document and put it in the tin box with the deed and Margaret's notes, and the copy of the forged notice, and the original letter from Albert Morse, and all the other pieces of the year. She closed the box. She sat with her hands folded on the table for a while. Then she got up, put her coat on, and went outside to find Caleb. Howe was in the barn, which had been his since August, in the loose-bordered way that things between them had evolved. Not formalized, not announced, simply present and real, and increasingly permanent in the way that solid things became permanent. She had not asked him to stay, and he had not asked her permission. They had simply, at some point in the late summer, stopped pretending that either of them was going to be somewhere else. I was repairing a harness when she came in, and he looked up. She held up the tin box. He understood immediately. He set the harness down and crossed the barn and took the box from her hands and opened it and looked at the settlement document on top, reading it in the way he read things, thoroughly, with full attention. When he looked up, his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He set the box on the workbench and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment, just a moment, and let herself be entirely still. It was the first time since April she had been entirely still. It lasted about 30 seconds before she needed to move again. She stepped back. He let her, the way he always let her. "I want to do something," she said. "All right," he said. "I want to write a letter to the Kansas City County Records Office," she said, "requesting a review of the water rights case against my father's farm, citing the Caldwell precedent and the Aldridge survey connection." She paused. Gerald Holt used the same method. If Aldridge did work in Kansas— "Eleanor," Caleb said. He said it with the particular weight of a man who had something to say that he had been choosing the right moment for. She stopped. "I sent a letter to the Kansas City Records Office in November," he said. "I used the documentation from Dalby's case as reference. I asked them to pull the Whitaker Farm survey records." She stared at him. "I got a response in January," he said. "I've been waiting for the right moment." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded letter that was creased the way letters got when they'd been folded and unfolded several times. "The original survey of your father's farm was conducted by an Aldridge associate. The connection is clear enough that Dalby thinks it can be included in the territorial investigation as a related case." Eleanor's throat closed in a way she did not try to prevent. "You did that," she said, "in November." "You were busy with the Cheyenne proceedings," he said. "And I wanted to do something. Something for your father." He paused. "For you. Something that was mine to give." She looked at the letter in his hand. Thomas Whitaker had walked out of a courthouse in Kansas City looking 10 years older than he'd walked in, and she had held his hand in a small room above a hardware store, and she had made him a promise. The promise was not just about 60 acres in Wyoming. It had never been only about that. She took the letter. She read it. Dalby's name was in the third paragraph, with a reference to the territorial case number and a request for the Kansas records to be forwarded to the Cheyenne office. It would take time. It might not result in anything that restored what had been taken. The farm was gone, sold 3 times over since Gerald Holt had taken it. Thomas Whitaker was dead, but his name would be in a record that said the truth. That said what had been done to him and why and who had done it. That was not nothing. That was everything Eleanor had promised him it would be. "Caleb," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady, and she did not try to make it so. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her with that open, unguarded expression she had first seen in the yard in August, and that she had come to understand was the most real thing about him. The face he showed when he was not managing anything, just being present in the moment that mattered. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm thanking you anyway." Spring came back to the valley the way it always did, with the specific violence of Wyoming spring. Not gentle, not gradual, but sudden and insistent. The snow retreating in days rather than weeks. The ground coming back to itself with an urgency that felt personal. Eleanor was in the field when Nora Finch arrived on the last Saturday of March, in a wagon with Clara Garrity beside her, and 3 other women from the Ladies' Auxiliary in the back, and an energy about the whole convoy that was unusual enough to make Eleanor come down from what she was doing and walk to the fence. "We're making something," Nora said, without preamble. "Good morning to you too, Mrs. Finch," Eleanor said. "There's going to be a community record," Nora said, ignoring this, "of everything that happened in this valley last year. I've spoken with Daniel Sullivan, who has agreed to be the primary writer. The boy has a gift, and somebody ought to use it. And we're going to document the whole thing from the time you arrived in April until the settlement in February. Names, dates, what happened, what was done about it." She looked at Eleanor steadily. "It's going to go in the county archive, so that when something like this is attempted again, and it will be attempted again, maybe not in our lifetimes, maybe not by Caldwell, but by someone, there will be a record of how it was stopped." Eleanor looked at her. "The Ladies' Auxiliary is doing this?" she said. "The Ladies' Auxiliary has a significant amount of administrative experience and very little to do in spring before planting. Nora said crisply. It seemed like a useful application. Clara Garrity, from the wagon seat, said, Pete cried when I told him. He won't admit it, but he did. I believe you, Eleanor said. She looked at the 5 women in the wagon, and she thought about what it had taken to get here. Not just the documents and the depositions and the Cheyenne hearings, but Nora Finch correcting inaccurate information wherever she found it, and Clara Garrity's sharp eyes writing everything down at the Saturday meeting, and Daniel Sullivan's methodical mind building the timeline, and Frank Becker pulling out 14 months of letters from inside his jacket, because he'd kept them without knowing why. All the people who had done their part without knowing they were doing their part. Tell Daniel, Eleanor said, that I want to give him a statement about Margaret Walker. She paused. She should be in the record. She started it. She should be in it. Nora Finch's expression softened in a way Eleanor had not seen before. Yes, she said, she should. The record was completed in June and filed with the county archive on the 22nd of that month, which happened to be Eleanor's birthday, which she had not told anyone, and which was therefore not an intentional choice on anyone's part, and which she therefore accepted as the kind of coincidence that felt like something without being anything you could point to. Caleb gave her a book. Not a practical book, a novel, a story, something only for the pleasure of it, which she'd mentioned once in passing in September, that she almost never let herself have, because pleasure had always felt like something to be earned in full before it was allowed. You've earned it, he said simply, when she looked at the book in her hands. You've been earning it all year. She looked at him. She thought about what she'd told Frank Becker's daughter in the corridor outside the hearing room. About people doing work that matters before they know it matters. She thought about her father and Margaret Walker, and all the careful documentation of all the things that had been done wrong. The long, patient record of ordinary people trying to hold on to what was theirs in the face of forces that were larger and better resourced and entirely indifferent to whether they survived. She thought about a girl who arrived in April with a mule and a wagon and 60 acres of land nobody wanted. She thought about who that girl had become by the time the first frost came. She thought about who she was now, standing in the yard of the home she had built with her own hands, in June, with the valley green around her and the spring running steady in the back 40, and a man beside her who had never once told her what she couldn't do. She opened the book. She read the first line. Then she set it in her lap and looked at the mountains, and she did the thing she had never entirely allowed herself to do in all the years since the courthouse in Kansas City. She let herself believe it was going to be all right. Not perfect. Not without more difficulty ahead, more seasons of hard work, more problems that didn't have easy solutions. The land didn't offer easy solutions, and she'd stopped wanting them. But all right. Genuinely, solidly, built on real ground, all right. Caleb sat down beside her on the step. Neither of them said anything for a while. The creek ran. The hawk made its sound on the ridge. Gideon moved in the corral with his characteristic opinion about nothing in particular. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked. Eleanor looked at the mountains. "I'm thinking," she said, "that my father would have liked this valley." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I think Margaret would have liked you," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "I know," she said. "You told me that once before." "I know," he said. "I meant it then. I mean it more now." She looked back at the mountains. Thomas Whitaker's name was going into a territorial record in Cheyenne that said a wrong had been done to him and what form that wrong had taken. Margaret Walker's handwriting was in the county archive of Red Willow, Wyoming, permanently, as the first documentation of a fraud that had taken 8 years and one very determined woman to bring to light. And Eleanor Whitaker's 60 acres sat in the valley she had chosen, on land she had built from nothing into something real, with the deed in the tin box and the spring running clean and the crops coming in for the second year, and a home that was hers in every sense that mattered. She had not needed to be saved. She had needed to be believed, and when no one believed her, she had built the evidence until belief was no longer a matter of faith, but of record. That was the difference. That had always been the difference. Eleanor Whitaker picked up her book, turned to the first page, and began to read. Not because the work was finished, because the work was never finished, but because she had earned this hour, and she knew it, and she was done waiting for permission to claim what she had already made.